Magandang araw po sa inyong lahat. Salamat po sa inyong patuloy na pakikipag-aralan ng salita ng Diyos through this social media platform, Maniwala Facebook Live. As you will notice, wala po ako sa aking regular studio recording studio at I would like to thank the leadership and the members of the Tayabas Church of Christ dito po sa Tayabas City for lending yung pong kanilang recording, yung kanilang venue so that I can record this topic that we will be talking about in the next few minutes. Sa mga susunod pong mga linggo, mga kapatid, I would like to attempt na pag-usapan natin ang isang paksa na, I will say, seemingly intense or provocative among those who teach the gospel, among those who teach the good news of salvation. At ang issue na akin pong tinutukoy sa araw na ito ay ang biblical teaching on baptism. Bakit nga ba ang mga Christ-centered, Bible-believing, gospel-preaching churches ay nagkakaiba-iba sa kanilang pananaw sa baptism? Ito po ba ay talagang mahalaga for salvation or is it only necessary after pagkatapos na manampalataya kay Jesus bilang tagapagligtas? Matapos na magkaroon ng kaligtasan and then you will be baptized merely as an outward sign of an inward faith? Yun po ba ang ibig sabihin ng baptism? Now, yun po ang ating pag-uusapan in the next few weeks. What exactly happens at baptism? Sinabi ng Ephesians chapter 2 verses 8 hanggang 10 that we are saved by grace through faith in order to do good works. Kung ito ay totoo, what then is the role of baptism in salvation? Is it just one of the commands? Isa lang ba ito sa mga utos na dapat ginagawa ng bawat isang mananampalataya, kagaya ng pananalangin, pagbabasa ng Biblia? Ito po ba ang ibig sabihin ng baptism? Ito po ba ang role ng baptism? As I begin, I would like to give you 3 disclaimers, tatlo pong mga pagpapauna na sa lahat. Number 1, I ask for patience to some for discussion to follow might be a little bit different from a simple Bible study. I hope that you are ready to deepen your understanding, especially on this subject of baptism. I ask for patience. Pangalawa po, I do not anticipate everyone will agree on what I will be discussing here. But please consider that this is a dialogue po ito, meaning an exchange of ideas of a fellow student struggling to understand God's truth like you. And it is not a debate. This is not a debate. It is not an attack to anyone's belief. That is my second disclaimer. And my third disclaimer is this. I will both use and interact with a lot of materials my former professor of theology wrote and taught me, none other than Dr. Jack Cottrell. And he passed away on September 16, 2022. And so this is our plan. This is the 3 areas of studies that we will be looking at as we focus on baptism. First, we will look at the historical, then second on the theological, and third on the biblical views ng baptism. Historical, theological, biblical, and obviously we don't have an easy task in the next few weeks. And so today, let us talk about this baptism part 1, historical. Ano nga po ba ang kasaysayan o nangyari sa tinatawag po nating baptism in history? Now, there is a materials that Jack Cottrell wrote in the Christian Standard, June 2004, at sabi niya, there are 15 million evangelicals and they cannot be wrong. I do not know exactly what he was referring to, but perhaps he was referring to the Frenchmen or theologians at Western Europe, those evangelicals who believe that baptism is an expression of obedience to Jesus as a member of the body of Christ. And he called this 50 million evangelicals as the majority. Ito yung nakakarami. Now, I do not know how many evangelicals we have in the Philippines. But I know they also have the majority view of saying that baptism is an expression, ito po ay expression of obedience to Jesus, and it is just simply obeying the command. Mahalaga ito sapagkat ito inutos ng Panginoong Jesus. Now, the rest of those who don't believe that baptism is an expression of obedience, but rather baptism is the point of time, it is the occasion, it is the event when God bestows salvation, sila naman po yung tinatawag na the minority group. Yung mas nakakaunti, yung hindi maraming naniniwala. Ang sabi po ni Dr. Jack Cattell ay ganito, and this is the position that he took. Sabi niya, long ago, I decided to accept the Bible alone as my only norm for faith and practice. And long ago, I became convinced that everything the New Testament says about the meaning of baptism can be summed up as water baptism is the God's appointed time when He first gives saving grace to the believing, repentant sinners. Of course, this is the minority view among the evangelicals. At ang sabi pa nga niya, well, if this is the minority view, I don't care. The Bible is my norm. It is the norm. It is the standard for faith and practice. And so I don't care if I belong to the minority group. Sabi pa nga niya as he quotes or as he quoted Romans 3:4, let God be found true, though every man be found a liar. And so he said in his article in the Christian Standard, June 2004, that it was created by the Swiss reformer Ulrich Zwingli. He lived 1484 to 1531. That Zwingli developed further by John Calvin, and this view of baptism as an expression of obedience was accepted through most of the Protestant world. So it was Zwingli, developed further by John Calvin, and accepted through most of the Protestant world. Ang sabi niya, what I will say now may surprise some, but the truth is this. The modern evangelical view of baptism is actually the new view, an interpretation of baptism that was invented only in the early 1520s. So he was saying that until Zwingli, the entire Christian world, for the first 1,500 years of its history, agreed. And what did they agree about? Water baptism is God-appointed time when He, meaning God, first gives saving grace to sinners. And so this is His plea. Ito po ang kanyang pakiusap, request, prayer. Na in developing one's own conviction concerning baptism today, sabi niya, that we will not limit our historical perspective to contemporary evangelicalism or to what seems to be the popular idea in the last at least 200 years. Kasi dito po halos nakabatay sa last 200 years ang majority view ng baptism. Ang sabi niya, ang kanyang pakiusap, ang kanyang panalangin, understand what the original and true consensus and who the real innovators are. Unawain natin kung sino talaga ang nagbago at bumago at nagpalit ng pananaw sa tinatawag nating turo ng patungkol sa bautismo. And this is his view. The modern evangelical view of baptism is actually the new view. Ito ang bagong pananaw. Ito ang kalulutang lang. Ito ang kapapanganak lamang na pananaw. And so his position, his thesis, at ang kanyang advokasya ito. From the time of the Apostle Paul through Augustine, hindi lamang po through Augustine, even up to Martin Luther, there was 1,500-year consensus on the meaning of baptism. And that was his thesis. Yun po yung kanyang advokasya. Yun po ang kanyang binibitawang mahalagang mga panalita. Nagbago lamang nitong after mga 1520s ang pananaw sa tinatawag po nating baptism. So ano po yung consensus ng mula kay Apostol Pablo sa New Testament at sa mga church fathers at tuloy-tuloy po hanggang kay Martin Luther? Ang pananaw po is that water baptism is the God-appointed time when He, meaning God, first gives saving grace to sinner. Now, meron po siyang sinite na mga early church fathers that I will not read to you, but I will simply give the names to you. Mga church fathers, mga early writers, kagaya po ni Justin Martyr na naniniwala na it is the washing away of the sin and it happens at the time of baptism. So Justin Martyr advocated for this view. Even Cyril of Jerusalem noong AD 315, nabuhay po siya ng AD 315 to 386, yun din po ang kanyang advocacy when going down, ang sabi ni Cyril of Jerusalem, into the water, think not of the bare element, but look for salvation by the power of the Holy Ghost. Even yung pong kilalang nating magaling na 5th century writer Augustine, AD 354 to 430. Ang sabi niya, we are joined to Christ by baptism. Indeed, the person is baptized for the express purpose of being with Christ. Even a medieval writer like Thomas Aquinas, he said the same thing. No one can obtain salvation but through Christ. But for this end is baptism conferred on a man, that being regenerated thereby, he may be incorporated in Christ. Consequently, ang sabi po ni Thomas Aquinas, it is manifested that all are bound to be baptized, and that without baptism there is no salvation for men. Now, Jack Cottrell was trying to sustain the fact, to thwart the fact na from the time of the Apostle Paul through the time of Martin Luther, ay isa po lamang that baptism is the God-appointed time where God bestows His saving grace. And so let's go to Martin Luther, which is very popular to many of us, the 16th century reformer. And many have assumed that because Martin Luther opposed the Catholic doctrine of the sacraments and championed the Protestant doctrine of justification by faith, he must have been the one who rejected baptism as a point in time or as a salvation event. Hindi po totoo yun. Luther's view of the meaning of baptism stands in direct continuity. Ipinagpatuloy po ni Martin Luther ang pananaw ng New Testament ng early church fathers at ng mga Catholic scholars who preceded him. He did not change the view of baptism, and even Martin Luther, ang 16th century reformer, ay nagsasabi that it is at the time or during baptism na God's saving grace is being bestowed upon believers. In his small catechism for Book 4:6, in answer to the question, what gifts or benefits has baptism bestowed? Ang sabi po ni Luther ay ganito, it effects forgiveness of sins. Ano daw po ang ibinibigay, idinudulot ng baptism? Ang sabi niya, it effects forgiveness of sin. This is part of the work of baptism. In it, the forgiveness takes place through God's covenant. That's Martin Luther. Sabi pa niya, forgiveness takes place in baptism because that is where the blood of Christ applied to the sinner. Through baptism, he is bathed in the blood of Christ and is cleansed from sin. Ito po ang sabi ni Luther. Sabi pa niya, for it is one thing to forgive sins and another thing to put them away or drive them out. But both the forgiveness and the driving out of sins are the work of baptism. And sinabi pa rin po ni Martin Luther, one is baptized so that he may receive in the water the promised salvation. Napakaliwanag po ng theology ni Martin Luther na tinatawag po nating act of baptism or baptism. And so there was a continuity of the teaching of baptism as the God-appointed time na kung saan ang isang tao ay tumatanggap ng regalo ng Diyos, ng biyaya ng Diyos, and it is at the time of baptism. So from the Apostle Paul, from the biblical times, to the early church writers, to the medieval writers, up to the 16th century reformer Martin Luther, this is the New Testament, the New Testament's own doctrine of baptism, and it was affirmed to be such by 15 centuries of Christian writers. Wala pong pagdududa, ito po ang pinaniniwalaan ng maraming mananampalataya for the last 1,500 years of Christianity. It is important to understand history and the history of the doctrine of baptism. Kaya nga po dito tayo nagsimula. Cottrell pointed out, if this view sounds strange to the majority of modern Protestants, it is because this biblical consensus has been replaced in most denominations with the alien interpretation of baptism that originated in the 1520s in the mind of Ulrich Zwingli. In other words, Zwingli changed the trajectory of, or the direction, the purpose, the meaning, and the benefits of baptism, which was originally, take note of the word, originally, for the purpose of salvation. How did it happen? Paano nangyari yon? Well, understanding Zwingli, he was a Swiss Protestant Reformation leader, and both Luther and Zwingli began their reforming activities in the 1520s. Pareho po silang reformers. Si Zwingli po ay nasa Swiss Protestants, and Luther was in Germany, and their general goal was obviously similar as reformers, to change the existing church, to reform the existing church. But they parted on their view of the sacraments in general. Zwingli's view of the sacrament changed, and Luther continued to teach that baptism is a saving work of God. Zwingli did not. Zwingli rejected Luther's view and made baptism entirely a work of man. No, take note on that. Ang ginawa po ni Zwingli, contrary to what Luther said, appointed time, where God bestows His saving grace, ang ginawa po ni Zwingli, he said, baptism is a work of man. Man's work. And that all, sabi niya, the teachers have been in error even from the time of the apostles. Zwingli rejected the original view of baptism. Obviously, he rejected the original view of baptism. Beginning as early as 1523, he rejected any connection between baptism and salvation. Walang kaugnayan ang bautismo sa kaligtasan. Zwingli denied that the water itself has any power to remove the effects of sin. Sabi niya, anong halaga ng tubig para maalis ang kasalanan ng tao. Zwingli denied that God cleanses the soul at the time of baptism. And so Zwingli rejected the original view of baptism, which is the New Testament teaching. And the general rule for Zwingli was salvation precedes or comes before the baptism that symbolizes it. Ang kaligtasan ay dumating na bago pa lamang ang panahon ng bautismo. Why did Zwingli teach this? Or where was he coming from? Why did Zwingli teach salvation comes before baptism and not during baptism? Number one, he believed that the baptism for salvation view contradicts salvation by grace alone through the blood of Christ. Tinatanggihan po niya ito. At ang sabi niya, it is contradictory to the fact that salvation is by grace alone, and if you think that man's work, because the baptism is man's work according to him, therefore it contradicts, baptism contradicts the salvation by grace. Secondly, why he is saying, or he was saying that salvation comes before baptism and not during, is that he believed that the view would contradict God's sovereignty. That is God's freedom to act when and where He chooses. Kasi po para kay Zwingli, it is election that saves, not baptism, and not even faith. Walang kinalaman lahat ito, wala itong kaugnayan lahat sa tinatawag nating kaligtasan. Walang kaugnayan ng ang baptism sa salvation, kahit na ang faith. Well, because it is God's freedom to act and to choose, kahit yung faith mo, it is even God's gift to you. Thirdly, why did Zwingli teach salvation comes before baptism? He rejected the original view of baptism and embraced philosophical dualism instead. Ano po yung philosophical dualism? Napag-usapan na po natin yung dualism sa nakaraan, the spirit over matter or the soul over body. Hindi mahalaga ang matter masyado. Ang mahalaga yung spirit. Hindi mahalaga masyado ang katawan. Ang mahalaga yung kaluluwa. And he embraced philosophical dualism. And therefore, kung ang spirit ang mahalaga at hindi ang matter, at kung ang mahalaga ay soul at hindi body, therefore, hindi mahalaga yung water. Hindi mahalaga yung bautismo. And that is a case for what we call dualism. He was guilty of dualism. Zwingli's question was, how can water, meaning the physical matter, have anything to do with the salvation of the soul? Ito ang tanong niya. Because he embraced philosophical dualism. In other words, material water cannot contribute in any way to the cleansing of the soul. Kaya naman ang kanyang conclusion ay ganito. Baptism is not necessary for salvation. So he affirms that faith alone is necessary for salvation, and he emphasized the fact that we are saved by faith only. Tanungin naman natin, ano ang ginawa at paano ipinaliwanag ni Zwingli ang lahat ng mga New Testament text or scriptures about baptism? Paano nga niya ipinaliwanag yung sinasabi ng Biblia na napakarami patungkol sa salvation, patungkol po sa baptism, patungkol sa grace, most especially, anong sinabi ni Zwingli patungkol po sa baptism na nakalagay sa New Testament? Number one, it boils down to figure of speech. Figure of speech. If we say baptism takes away sins, that is just a figure of speech. For it is not baptism that takes them away, but faith. And he explains away the word baptism in two ways. Inalis niya po ang paniniwala at ang katotohanan na sinabi ng Biblia patungkol sa baptism sa dalawang pamamaraan. Yung tinatawag nga po nating figure of speech at ginamit po niya yung tinatawag na metonymy. Metonymy is a figure of speech where a part is mentioned but it means the whole. Ang ibig kong sabihin ng metonymiya, ang isang halimbawa ay ito sa Bible, my praise shall continually be in my mouth. Hindi po yung pagpupuri ay nasa bibig, kundi ang aking pagpupuri, ang aking buong pagkatao, iniaalay ko ang aking buong pagkatao. Mentioning the part, but referring to the whole actually. Yun po yung metonymy. The mouth is used by the intended meaning, my whole life, my whole being. Sa Tagalog po, ang metonymy ay pagpapalit-tawag. Ang isang halimbawa po nito sa atin ay pag nanonood kayo ng mga balita, ay sinasabi ng mga broadcaster ng ganito, ipinaliwanag ng Malacanang. Obviously, hindi po nagsasalita ang venue, ang place, ang Malacanang. Ang ibig kong sabihin ng ipinaliwanag ng Malacanang, ang tinutukoy dito ay ang sinabi ng Pangulo. Ito po yung metonymiya. Therefore, every time na parang sinasabi na every time we read, yung pong tinatawag nating baptism, ang sabi po niya, ito yung metonymiya at ang ibig sabihin nito ay tumutukoy lamang ito sa bahagi. Sa bahagi lamang ng kabuuan na kaligtasan ng tao. Now, it is important po na maunawaan natin kung saan nanggagaling si Zwingli, sapagkat ganito nga po niya pinapaliwanag yung mga New Testament texts. Ano ho? Now, number 2, paano kanya ipinaliwanag yung mga New Testament texts about baptism? Number 2, the key word is deconstruction. Deconstruction. Una po ay figure of speech, pangalawa po, deconstructions. He deconstructed the original meaning of baptism and carefully constructed a completely new purpose or meaning of the act of baptism. And he made this theology called, he created this theology called, ang tawag po ay covenant theology. How did Zwingli do it? 2 things. He decided that infant baptism must be maintained. Dapat pa rin na magpatuloy ang infant baptism. And at the same time, pangalawa po, he also rejected the traditional distinction between the Old and the New Covenant. Kaya nga po ang tawag ay covenant theology. Bakit po? Kasi inalis niya, he removed the traditional distinction between the Old and the New Covenant. So, pagsasamahin po natin yung dapat magpatuloy ang infant baptism, pagkatapos walang distinction ng Old and New Covenant, at ang nangyari po, one covenant or covenant unity or covenant theology. Instead of seeing 2 covenants, the Old and the New Covenants, the Old and the New, he introduced one covenant of grace or the concept of covenant unity. So then, kapag iisa lamang ang covenant, ang tipan ng Diyos, at ito'y covenant of grace, covenant unity, so therefore there is also one covenant people. One covenant people. One covenant unity, covenant people, at hindi po lamang yon, sapagkat merong one covenant people, ang ibig pong sabihin ni ni Zwingli, the Israelites of old and the Christians of today are all part of the same body, the same church, or the same covenant God made with Abraham. Yung pong ibig sabihin ng one covenant. So the Mosaic covenant was temporary. Alam natin yun. Sabi niya, temporary lang yan. It was set aside. When it was set aside, the Abrahamic covenant continued on. Kaya ito po ang naging trilogy. Zwingli's trilogy. One covenant unity, the old and the new. One covenant people, Israel and the church. Therefore, there's only one covenant sign. And guess what is the covenant sign? Circumcision. Ang pagtutuli. And based on the reasoning, Zwingli totally equated the meaning of baptism in the New Testament, yung bautismo sa bagong tipan, with the meaning of the Old Testament circumcision. And so what he did, iisa lang ang kahulugan ng New Testament baptism at Old Testament circumcision, where each act of circumcision is simply a sign of membership in the one covenant people. Bakit ba nagkakaroon ng pagtutuli sa Old Testament ang mga Jews? Because they were already members of the Hebrew people. Kinakailangan magkaroon lang ng senyales, ng sign na ikaw ay talagang kabilang na, at ang sign na ikaw ay kabilang na ay walang iba kundi ang circumcision. As Old Testament people were being circumcised because they are already a part or member of the people of God, Israel. Ang sabi ni Zwingli, the New Testament people are being baptized because they are already a part or member of Jesus' followers. They are already a part of the church. Kung paano ang Old Testament circumcision ay pinapractice because they already belong sa Judaism, sa Judaismo, at ang palatandaan ay ang circumcision, ganon din naman sa Kristyanismo, sa bagong tipan, ang palatandaan na ikaw ay miyembro na ay ang tinatawag nating baptism, which is the Old Testament circumcision, the New Testament baptism. Ano po naging bunga? This is now the usual explanation of most evangelical churches concerning baptism. This is the reason many evangelical churches baptize infants, and they teach faith only to be saved. A person is being baptized for he is already saved. Ligtas na siya, kaya siya ay nababautisman. Gaya sa Old Testament circumcision, miyembro na siya ng Israelita ng Judaism, ng Judaismo, kaya ang sign na lang ay ang pagpapatuli. So what happens at the time of baptism? Ano ngayon ang nangyayari kapag binabautismo na ayon kay Zwingli? Well, according to Zwingli, the person being baptized is making a pledge of allegiance to the Christian community. Nangangako ako. Ito yung isang pangangako para sa kanya at sa kanyang itinuro. Baptism is a public testimony. It is a public testimony. Testimonya patotoo. I am showing you, parang gano'n. I am showing you right now in baptism, right now, the time being baptized, what already has happened inside me. May nangyari na sa akin at ipinakikita ko lang sa inyo ngayon in public. So we hear yung mga sinasabing ng maraming mga kaibigan natin at mga kasama natin sa Christian community that baptism is an outward sign of an inward faith or an inward commitment to live the Christian life. Secondly, hindi lamang po ito pledge of allegiance, kundi baptism is also a sign of belonging to the covenant people or being one with those who are already saved. Belongingness. Belongingness. This is the same as the idea and function of the Old Testament circumcision. A person being baptized has already been saved, but now being baptized as a sign of what? Yung baptism is a sign of membership in the church. And this is how it develops. And it is important that we understand yung pong history ng baptism. In summary, there is a big difference between the meaning of baptism in the first 1,500 years of Christian history from the Apostle Paul, from the teaching of the Apostle Paul, through Augustine and the medieval writers, up to Martin Luther. Nagkaroon po ng malaking pagbabago, and the meaning of baptism since Zwingli, and that is approximately around 524 years or 5 centuries. Nagbago po ang paniniwala at ang pagtuturo sa kahulugan ng bautismo for the last 520 years, more or less, but 24. In the first 1,500 years of Christianity, baptism was seen as God's work. It is God's work. It is God's appointed time. It is the event by which God Himself is bestowing His salvation, His grace. But since Zwingli, in the 1520s, baptism is now seen as man's work. Pinalitan yung baptism is God's work, napalitan ng baptism is man's work, bearing witness to the salvation already received. Zwingli ignored intentionally, unintentionally, the New Testament teachings of baptism and formulated the new doctrine of baptism. Again, the challenge of Jack Cottrell, as he quoted Romans chapter 3, verse 4, let God be found true, though every man be found a liar. Sa akin mong pagkatapos, and this is only part 1, we will be talking about baptism, the theological view, next time. The question is this: will the real innovator on the teaching of baptism please stand? Yung tunay na talagang bumago ng katuruan ng Biblia patungkol sa bautismo, pwede bang tumayo? And as I can see with my professor, Dr. Jack Cottrell, kung sila po ay, if they were sitting side by side, and this question was asked, will the real innovator on the teaching of baptism please stand? My speculation is Dr. Jack Cottrell or Jack Cottrell will whisper to Zwingli, bubulong, at sasabihin niya, will you please stand? Will you please stand? Marami pong salamat mga kaibigan, mga kapatid, sa inyong patuloy na pakikipagkaisa, although kuminsan challenging po ang ating pinag-uusapan, a little bit intense, but I hope that you are understanding where we are coming from. We are all strugglers in understanding the truth of God. We are not attacking anyone. We are dialoguing. We are just exchanging ideas and views here. And I hope na everyone will take this as a study and you will continue to wrestle on your knees on what really the Bible is teaching about baptism. Hanggang sa muli po, mga kapatid, mga kaibigan, nagbibigay po ng papuri sa Diyos, nagpapasalamat po sa inyong lahat, Jonathan Orellasa.